because we're going to be approaching the 30-year mark this coming Christmas. But police are not saying what this new evidence is or who has been interviewed, but they are confirming that new and follow-up interviews have been conducted.
Welcome back to my channel. At 5:52 a.m., a ransom note was found inside a quiet Colorado home. But what police would later overlook may have mattered far more than anything written on that page. A 6-year-old child, a Christmas night that never ended, and an investigation that seemed to move, yet somehow stayed frozen in time. And what you're about to hear is not rumor. It's about facts that were documented, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside. What if the JonBenét Ramsey case was closer to being solved than anyone realized, and then something surfaced that changed everything?
But police are not saying what this new evidence is or who has been interviewed.
Imagine investigators standing inside the house, believing they understood the crime scene, while critical details were hiding in plain sight. Now here's where the case takes its first major turn. Just when the investigation appeared to be narrowing, a new clue emerged that shifted the entire direction of the case and left even seasoned detectives shaken. Why was the basement window dismissed so quickly? Why were certain fibers never fully followed up? Why did timelines change, and who benefited from that confusion? Evidence that could have clarified the sequence of events was labeled inconclusive, even though it raised serious questions about how the crime actually unfolded. Let's talk facts. There was no clear sign of forced entry at the main doors. Could someone have entered the home without breaking in? Or might they have already been inside earlier that night? The ransom note was unusually long and written inside the house. Is it possible the note was meant to delay discovery rather than demand money? Certain forensic indicators did not fully align with the official narrative. Could the crime have unfolded differently than originally believed, with a sequence that was misunderstood from the start? And then came the moment that changed everything. Just as investigators believed the case was settling into a familiar explanation, an overlooked detail resurfaced, one that didn't fit and forced a complete reassessment of what was thought to be true. This wasn't about blaming. This wasn't about pointing fingers. This was about evidence and what happens when it's ignored. So ask yourself, were these oversights accidental or the result of early assumptions that couldn't be undone? And most importantly, what do you think happened that night? Because once you see what was missed, the JonBenét Ramsey case may never look the same again. The JonBenét Ramsey investigation formally began in the early hours of December 26, 1996, when a handwritten ransom note was discovered inside the family home in Boulder, Colorado. The note, found on a staircase used by the household, immediately redirected suspicion outward by presenting the crime as a kidnapping carried out by an unknown intruder. At first review, the document appeared to establish motive, intent, and authorship external to the family. However, investigators quickly noted features that conflicted with known patterns of ransom communications, particularly its length, phrasing, and material source, which did not align with scenarios involving haste or limited access. The letter was not written quickly, nor on paper brought from outside, but appeared to be composed calmly within the home itself. The note spanned multiple pages, an uncommon characteristic when compared with documented ransom cases analyzed by law enforcement agencies. It referenced specific monetary figures and employed language that alternated between formal commands and informal expressions. The paper and pen were later identified as items belonging to the household, a detail confirmed through police inventory and forensic review. These elements raised immediate questions regarding whether the letter functioned as an authentic ransom demand or served another purpose within the sequence of events. Despite its central role, the letter produced no ransom call, no verified follow-up, and no external contact that would confirm the scenario it described. Investigators documented that the instructions within the note were not fully executed, and the absence of communication from any alleged kidnapper introduced uncertainty. Handwriting analysis was conducted by multiple experts over time, yet official findings consistently described the results as inconclusive. No individual could be definitively identified or excluded solely based on the handwriting, and no unique attribution met the evidentiary threshold required for prosecutorial action. As a result, the ransom letter remained influential but unresolved as a piece of evidence. The letter, positioned as a shield against suspicion, instead became a silent instrument that complicated the investigation while a child lay undiscovered inside the same house. Further examination focused on linguistic choices and structure. Analysts noted that the tone did not consistently reflect urgency, and the length suggested time and privacy. Law enforcement reports acknowledged that a hurried intruder would have faced significant risk remaining inside the residence long enough to draft such a document. At the same time, officials cautioned that these observations alone could not conclusively establish authorship or intent, emphasizing that behavioral assumptions do not equate to proof. What initially appeared to clarify the crime may have instead delayed understanding of how the night truly unfolded. From an evidentiary standpoint, the ransom note introduced a framework that shaped early investigative priorities. Resources were directed toward validating a kidnapping narrative, even as inconsistencies emerged. Public reporting later confirmed that some investigators privately questioned whether the letter functioned as misdirection rather than communication, though no official determination was made. The document's existence, while undeniable, did not independently explain the sequence of events, the method of the crime, or the absence of external interaction. The ransom note was lengthy, written on household materials, and composed inside the residence, with no subsequent ransom communication. It is possible that the letter was intended to redirect attention outward and delay discovery rather than facilitate an actual exchange. It could have been written after the critical events occurred, serving to shape the initial narrative rather than initiate contact. Another possibility is that the author believed time was available and risk was minimal, suggesting familiarity with the environment. These interpretations remain theoretical, as no physical evidence conclusively establishes the timing or authorship of the note. The ransom letter remains one of the most analyzed yet unresolved components of the case. It neither confirms nor eliminates any single theory, but continues to influence how the investigation is understood. Its presence demonstrates how a single document, when inconclusive, can dominate an inquiry without resolving it. Based on the documented facts surrounding the ransom letter, what do you think its true purpose might have been? The investigative direction of the JonBenét Ramsey case changed fundamentally in the afternoon of December 26, 1996, when JonBenét's body was discovered inside the family residence. This finding immediately collapsed the kidnapping narrative established by the ransom letter and forced a sudden transition to a homicide investigation under police control. The location of the body, a small basement room often described in reports as a storage or utility space, had not been fully examined during the initial response. Public records indicate that the search leading to the discovery was conducted by John Ramsey after law enforcement suggested that friends and family check the house from top to bottom. The basement area where the body was found was dimly lit and partially concealed, factors cited in later reviews as contributing to its earlier oversight. Once the body was located, the scene was no longer consistent with an active kidnapping scenario, and investigative priorities shifted abruptly to determining cause, timing, and responsibility for the death. The physical condition of the body was documented by responding officers and later detailed in the autopsy report. Findings included ligature strangulation and evidence of head trauma. Medical examiners noted that the precise sequence of injuries could not be conclusively determined, and official conclusions described the cause of death as asphyxia associated with craniocerebral trauma. The report did not establish an exact time of death, leaving a window of uncertainty that complicated reconstruction of events during the night. The basement discovery also raised immediate concerns regarding crime scene integrity. By the time the body was found, multiple individuals had moved freely throughout the residence, including the basement. This movement introduced contamination risks affecting potential trace evidence, such as fibers, footprints, and touch DNA. Law enforcement later stated that these conditions limited the reliability of certain forensic conclusions and reduced the ability to establish a clear sequence of actions leading to the death. The sudden transition from a presumed kidnapping to an internal homicide required investigators to reassess earlier assumptions. Resources initially directed toward ransom-related communications were redirected toward forensic examination and interviews. However, the delay in identifying the body inside the home meant that early investigative steps were taken without full awareness of the crime's nature. This timing issue would later be cited in reviews as a factor that constrained the scope of recoverable evidence. From a legal standpoint, the location of the body inside the residence eliminated the possibility of an external exchange or removal and placed greater emphasis on access, opportunity, and movement within the home. Investigators documented the layout of the basement and its points of entry, though no definitive evidence established how or when the perpetrator entered or exited the area. The absence of clear signs of forced entry elsewhere in the house further complicated interpretation. JonBenet's body was found in a basement room hours after police had already searched the home and the scene had been accessed by multiple individuals. It is possible that the crime occurred earlier in the night and that the basement location was chosen to delay discovery. The perpetrator might have relied on the assumption that the area would not be immediately searched. Another possibility is that the sequence of events unfolded in stages, with the body remaining concealed while attention was directed elsewhere. These scenarios remain theoretical, as contamination and timing uncertainty prevent definitive reconstruction. The basement discovery remains a pivotal moment in the case, marking the point at which the investigation's original framework became untenable. From that moment forward, every subsequent theory had to account for the fact that the crime occurred within the home under circumstances that were not immediately recognized or preserved. The evidentiary limitations created during this period continue to influence how the case is evaluated decades later. Based on the documented timing and location of the basement discovery, what do you think is the most likely explanation for how the events unfolded inside the house? In the hours following the discovery of the ransom note, the Ramsey residence did not operate as a secured homicide scene. Police reports and later reviews confirm that friends, clergy members, and family acquaintances were permitted to enter the home freely, move between rooms, and remain present for extended periods. This approach was initially taken under the assumption that the case involved an active kidnapping rather than a homicide. As a result, standard crime scene protocols designed to preserve forensic integrity were not fully implemented during the most critical early window. By the time investigators understood a murder had occurred, the scene had already been altered beyond recovery. Multiple individuals cleaned surfaces, prepared food, and used common areas of the house. Doors were opened and closed repeatedly, and items were moved without documentation. Later internal assessments acknowledged that these actions introduced contamination risks that could not be measured or reversed. Potential trace evidence, including fibers, footprint impressions, and touch DNA, may have been displaced, mixed, or destroyed before systematic collection could occur. What evidence might have existed in those first hours is unknown because it was never preserved in its original state. Law enforcement officials later stated that once a crime scene is compromised, forensic interpretation becomes inherently limited. Even when samples are recovered, their evidentiary value depends on context, which had already been lost. This limitation was repeatedly cited in subsequent reviews and external analyses, particularly regarding fiber evidence and footprint impressions that could not be conclusively linked to a specific source. The home where a child died became a place of movement and conversation, while silent evidence disappeared under ordinary human activity. The presence of multiple people also complicated the process of determining who had been where and when. Investigators were required to account for innocent transfers of fibers and materials, increasing the difficulty of distinguishing relevant forensic findings from background contamination. Official statements later confirmed that this environment significantly narrowed the range of conclusions that could be drawn from physical evidence. From this moment forward, the case would rely less on physical proof and more on interpretation, because the scene itself could no longer speak clearly. The compromised crime scene also affected the timeline of the investigation. Key decisions were made before the homicide was formally recognized, and by the time procedures shifted, opportunities for uncontaminated collection had passed. This reality influenced how later evidence was evaluated, often requiring cautious language such as inconclusive or not a unique match in official reports. Numerous individuals entered and moved freely within the Ramsey home before it was secured as a homicide scene, resulting in contamination risks and loss of context for forensic evidence. It is possible that critical physical indicators were present initially, but were altered or destroyed through normal activity. This could have affected the ability to establish movement patterns, timing, or the presence of an unknown individual. It is also possible that the compromised environment made unrelated transfers appear suspicious, further complicating interpretation. These possibilities remain theoretical, as the original state of the scene cannot be reconstructed. The handling of the crime scene has been consistently identified as one of the most significant procedural weaknesses in the investigation. While later advances in forensic science offer improved analytical tools, they cannot restore context that was lost in the first hours. As a result, the compromised scene remains a defining factor in why definitive conclusions have proven difficult to reach. Given the documented contamination of the scene, what do you think investigators may have lost that could have changed the direction of the case? In the immediate aftermath of JonBenét Ramsey's death, law enforcement conducted extensive interviews with both parents, John and Patsy Ramsey. These initial sessions, occurring within the first 24 to 48 hours, documented recollections of Christmas Eve and Christmas morning, as well as movements within the residence. Analysis of the transcripts reveals that the parents' statements diverged in several areas, including the precise timing of their discovery of the ransom note, observations of household activity, and recollections of interactions with family and household staff. Investigators noted these inconsistencies, but did not immediately interpret them as evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, the differences were classified as areas requiring further verification and corroboration. Even minor timeline discrepancies in these early interviews had the potential to influence investigative direction and public perception in a case that had already captured national attention. Within the first 100 words of examination, investigators became aware that selective memory and variations in recall could produce conflicting accounts. Public records indicate that the parents' descriptions of JonBenét's behavior on the morning of December 25th differed in terms of duration, location, and specific actions. Law enforcement personnel acknowledged in later statements that stress, shock, and the unusual circumstances of the holiday may have affected the accuracy of immediate recollections, a factor repeatedly cited in official reviews. These divergent statements created an internal debate regarding credibility, complicating the process of establishing an authoritative timeline for the critical hours. The discrepancies were not limited to minor details. Reports highlight differences in recollection regarding who first noticed the staircase note and the precise sequence of movements within the home. Some statements included estimated times for events that could not be independently verified, and variations persisted despite multiple interview sessions. Internal documentation from the Boulder Police Department later reflected concern that even small inconsistencies could inadvertently influence investigative focus, while no formal charges or exclusions were issued at that stage. Every small contradiction amplified the complexity of reconstructing a night that had already produced limited physical evidence. Further examination of public records shows that investigators remained cautious, emphasizing that variations in memory are common in high-stress scenarios, particularly in households experiencing sudden trauma. The official approach focused on cross-referencing statements with physical evidence, timelines, and third-party observations where available. Despite procedural care, the early divergence in parental accounts created a permanent shadow over the clarity of the domestic timeline. The interplay between human memory and procedural limitations ensured that every subsequent theory would have to account for narrative uncertainty at the foundational level. Interviews with John and Patsy Ramsey contained differences in reported times, locations, and recollections of critical events, particularly concerning the discovery of the ransom note and initial household activity. It is possible that memory under stress contributed to variations without indicating intentional misrepresentation. Alternatively, the discrepancies might suggest that certain events were observed differently by each parent, influencing the perceived timeline. It is also likely that interactions with household staff and external visitors affected recall, creating inconsistencies in later statements. These possibilities remain theoretical, as no physical evidence corroborates one account over another, and investigators must rely on contextual analysis rather than definitive proof. The divergence in parental accounts illustrates the complexity of interpreting human recollection under duress. It highlights the necessity of corroborating statements with objective evidence and demonstrates how early narrative inconsistencies can have lasting influence over investigative direction. The official record preserves these discrepancies as significant yet unresolved, forming part of the enduring uncertainty surrounding the case. Based on the documented differences in parental accounts, what do you think might have contributed to these discrepancies in memory and perception? During the forensic examination of JonBenét Ramsey's clothing, analysts identified a partial DNA profile that did not match any immediate family members. This discovery introduced the potential for an intruder scenario, generating renewed investigative focus on unknown individuals who may have had access to the residence. Official statements indicate that the sample was limited, degraded, and could not be uniquely matched to a specific individual, a detail that was repeatedly emphasized in subsequent forensic reviews. The presence of DNA that could not be traced to the family highlighted the limitations of prior assumptions and introduced a new layer of complexity to a case long dominated by internal theories. For decades, public discourse had largely centered on family involvement, yet this unidentified DNA introduced a factual variable that could not be ignored. The sample, collected from areas of JonBenét's clothing consistent with secondary transfer possibilities, was analyzed multiple times by forensic laboratories. Reports note that environmental contamination, handling, and degradation reduced the evidentiary threshold, preventing conclusive identification. Public reporting confirms that the DNA was retained in national databases in an attempt to locate potential matches, but no confirmed identification has been achieved. These constraints mean that while the presence of foreign male DNA is a documented fact, its source and significance remain uncertain.
The unidentified DNA left investigators facing a pivotal question. Could there have been someone entirely unknown in the home, or was this material the result of incidental transfer? Subsequent reviews emphasized that while the sample was scientifically verified, interpretations must remain cautious. Experts consistently described the profile as partial and non-unique, with a high possibility of inconclusive association. In addition, no other forensic evidence definitively corroborated the presence of an unknown intruder, and official statements reinforced that conclusions about access, intent, or sequence could not be established from this evidence alone. The presence of this DNA sample created a tangible factual ripple, casting doubt over narratives previously assumed stable for years. Investigators continued to consider the sample alongside other evidence, including the ransom note, crime scene layout, and household access points. The combination of factors made it impossible to determine definitively whether the DNA represented an active participant in the crime, a trace left incidentally, or a contaminant introduced during early handling. Reports from forensic services repeatedly stressed that a unique match was not established, reinforcing the need for cautious interpretation. The unidentified DNA remained a single, unresolved data point, capable of altering investigative direction but unable to independently resolve the case. A partial DNA profile from an unknown male was recovered from JonBenét's clothing, with no match to family members, and the sample was degraded and inconclusive. It is possible that the DNA represents an unknown intruder who had access to the residence at or near the time of the crime. Alternatively, it could have been transferred indirectly through contact with items or individuals outside the immediate household, introducing trace evidence without indicating direct involvement. It is also likely that contamination during early handling cannot be fully excluded, limiting the ability to assign weight to this finding. These scenarios remain theoretical and rely solely on the documented characteristics of the sample. The unidentified DNA remains one of the most discussed elements of the Ramsey case. While it introduces a plausible external factor, its inability to provide a unique match or confirm sequence of events means that it must be evaluated in conjunction with other evidence rather than as a standalone indicator. The investigative record continues to reflect both its significance and its limitations. Considering the documented partial DNA, what do you think is the most likely explanation for its presence on JonBenét's clothing? In the weeks and months following JonBenét Ramsey's death, police records indicate that multiple investigative leads were documented but not exhaustively pursued. These included neighborhood tips, reports from acquaintances of the family, and individuals exhibiting proximity, opportunity, or behavioral indicators deemed potentially relevant. Official records and internal reviews describe these leads as deprioritized or shelved due to limited resources, procedural decisions, or perceived lack of immediacy. The aggregation of these uninvestigated avenues introduced long-term constraints on the case, leaving factual gaps that later investigators have repeatedly highlighted as problematic. Several individuals who appeared to be connected to the Ramsey household or the surrounding neighborhood were documented in reports but never interviewed in depth. The deprioritization of these leads created structural challenges in reconstructing the crime timeline. Investigators faced an expansive volume of tips, many of which lacked immediate verification. Law enforcement notes indicate that choices had to be made regarding allocation of personnel, and in several instances, leads with potential behavioral relevance were postponed. Subsequent reviews acknowledged that some of these decisions may have inadvertently limited the pool of information available to cross-reference physical evidence. The presence of unexamined tips introduces an enduring uncertainty regarding who may have been in proximity to the residence during critical windows. Public reporting indicates that several tips referenced unknown individuals or unusual activity near the home on the night of December 25, 26, 1996. These reports included sightings in the alley behind the Ramsey residence, unfamiliar vehicles, and persons behaving in ways that could not be corroborated. In each case, investigators later noted that follow-up either was minimal or was constrained to preliminary inquiries, preventing the establishment of a verified connection. Each deferred or incomplete investigation left a factual void that could not be retroactively reconstructed, creating permanent uncertainty in the case record. Internal documentation confirms that some of the individuals who were deprioritized had the potential for relevance due to physical proximity, prior association with the household, or behavioral observations suggesting possible access. Despite this, the absence of corroborated evidence prevented any lead from evolving into actionable insight. Analysts have emphasized that these gaps remain a central limitation in evaluating alternative scenarios, including intruder access or unforeseen domestic events.
As a result, the Ramsey investigation's trajectory was shaped not only by what was known, but by what remained unexplored.
Multiple tips and reports of potential individuals with access, opportunity, or suspicious behavior were documented but not fully pursued. It is possible that one or more of these individuals could have provided information or physical evidence that would have clarified sequence of events. It is also possible that deprioritization was necessary due to resource limitations, meaning no deliberate oversight occurred. Alternatively, some leads might have represented coincidental activity with no direct connection to the crime, illustrating the difficulty of distinguishing relevant from irrelevant information without corroboration. These scenarios remain theoretical, as official documentation does not establish definitive engagement with each tip. The incomplete follow-up on documented leads highlights a structural limitation in the case that continues to influence retrospective analysis. Although modern forensic and investigative methods offer enhanced tools, they cannot compensate for the absence of contemporaneous interviews or observations. These deferred leads remain part of the evidentiary record as unresolved possibilities, underscoring the complexity of reconstructing the sequence of events surrounding JonBenét Ramsey's death. Considering the documented tips and deprioritized leads, what do you think might have been revealed if each lead had been fully pursued during the initial investigation? Subsequent investigations into the JonBenét Ramsey case identified multiple potential points of entry to the residence that were not thoroughly examined during the initial response. Law enforcement and public reporting note that the rear alley, basement windows, and other minor openings could have provided plausible access routes for an intruder. While early investigative focus concentrated on internal family involvement and the ransom note, these external avenues received comparatively limited attention. The existence of these points underscores a procedural gap in initial scene management and prioritization of search efforts. Even areas immediately visible from the alley behind the home were not comprehensively secured, allowing potential access that remained unexplored for critical hours. Officials have stated that in 1996, the back alley behind the residence offered straightforward ingress to multiple rear doors and windows. Public records describe the alley as wide enough to accommodate vehicle or foot traffic, and note that privacy fencing, which would later restrict access, was minimal at the time of the incident. The back garage and basement windows provided points that, if utilized, could have allowed a person to enter undetected, yet early search protocols did not systematically rule out these options. These overlooked access points introduce uncertainty regarding who could have entered and exited without leaving immediately obvious evidence. Review of later site examinations confirms that the layout of the home, including multiple levels, side entrances, and uneven visibility from the street, offered practical opportunities for someone familiar with the property to approach unnoticed. Investigators acknowledged that while there was no direct evidence confirming intruder presence, the physical possibility existed. Early investigative emphasis on family-related theories may have inadvertently deprioritized systematic assessment of these points, leaving potential avenues for information or physical evidence untested. These limitations have persisted as a recognized gap in official reviews of investigative methodology. The combination of multiple potential entry points and incomplete early evaluation meant that a significant vector of inquiry remained largely unaddressed in the first hours of the investigation. Documentation indicates that police personnel were aware of the structural layout, but did not pursue exhaustive physical inspections or forensic sweeps of these areas at the time. Later commentary from investigative sources suggested that a more thorough early evaluation of rear access could have either corroborated or discounted the intruder hypothesis, but opportunities were limited by both procedural focus and the presence of family and visitors inside the home. These limitations have persisted as a recognized gap in official reviews of investigative methodology. The overlooked access points highlight how physical possibility may exist independently of confirmed usage, complicating interpretations decades later. Multiple potential entry points, including the rear alley, basement windows, and garage doors, were present at the Ramsey residence and were not exhaustively examined in initial searches.
It is possible that an unknown individual could have used one of these points to enter the home undetected. It might also be likely that the absence of forced entry elsewhere suggests either prior access, familiarity with the residence, or secondary transfer of materials. Another possibility is that some entry points never used and represent only theoretical avenues, illustrating the distinction between physical possibility and factual occurrence. These interpretations remain theoretical and rely exclusively on the documented structural features and investigative records. The presence of untested access points continues to influence modern assessments of the case. While no evidence confirms external involvement, the physical plausibility requires that investigators, both historically and in ongoing reviews, consider intruder scenarios alongside other potential explanations. The gap created by limited early evaluation serves as a cautionary note for both procedural rigor and interpretation of available forensic data. Given the documented potential for untested rear and basement access, what do you think is the most plausible explanation for how someone could have entered the home undetected?
In the course of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, prosecutorial and law enforcement narratives shifted repeatedly between theories emphasizing family involvement and those considering an external intruder. Internal memos and public records indicate that these shifts were influenced by emerging evidence, including the ransom note, the basement discovery, and the unidentified DNA profile. Early attention focused heavily on potential domestic culpability due to the presence of inconsistencies in parental statements and access to the home. Subsequent findings, particularly regarding unknown male DNA and overlooked entry points, prompted reconsideration of external involvement. These evolving theories contributed to procedural uncertainty and complicated the ability to present a coherent case. At one point, official communications oscillated so markedly that the public and potential jurors received conflicting impressions about who might be responsible for JonBenét's death. The constant reevaluation of prosecutorial positions created both internal and external tension. Prosecutors faced challenges in reconciling physical evidence, witness statements, and forensic limitations. Official commentary acknowledges that repeated theoretical adjustments slowed investigative momentum as resources and attention were diverted between competing possibilities. Public reporting noted that media coverage amplified the perception of indecision, reinforcing skepticism toward the investigation's consistency. These shifts were not indicative of improper conduct, but reflected the evidentiary uncertainty inherent in a case with limited physical proof and contaminated initial crime scenes. Each new piece of evidence prompted careful reconsideration, yet no adjustment produced definitive resolution. Internal reviews emphasized that changes in prosecutorial theory were guided by evolving understanding rather than arbitrary speculation. As forensic analysis advanced and DNA testing identified partial male profiles, previously discounted scenarios, such as the intruder hypothesis, regained consideration. Conversely, early focus on family access continued to shape investigatory questioning and the structuring of timelines. These dual approaches contributed to a prolonged state of ambiguity, which became a recurring theme in both official reports and media analysis. The vacillation between theories created a procedural inertia that left investigative conclusions suspended and public confidence weakened. The effect of shifting narratives on potential jurors and the broader community was significant. Legal observers have noted that inconsistent messaging can reduce perceived credibility, particularly in high-profile cases where media coverage frames expectations. While official reports stress that no suspect was formally charged or excluded based solely on these theoretical shifts, the perception of uncertainty has persisted. Changes in prosecutorial theory also affected how evidence was prioritized, influencing the sequencing of interviews, forensic testing, and follow-up on tips. The interplay of competing hypotheses demonstrates how evolving theory, even when evidence-based, can create a prolonged state of ambiguity that shapes public and investigative perception for decades.
Prosecutors and investigators repeatedly adjusted focus between family-based and intruder theories based on emerging evidence, including parental statements, forensic findings, and unidentified DNA. It is possible that the shifts reflect necessary responsiveness to complex evidence rather than any bias or oversight. It might also be likely that maintaining simultaneous consideration of multiple scenarios helped preserve investigative neutrality, though it introduced confusion for external observers. Another possibility is that repeated adjustments delayed actionable conclusions, affecting prioritization of leads or resources. These interpretations remain theoretical and rely solely on documented changes in official investigative approach, statements, and publicly reported procedural decisions. The changing prosecutorial theories in the JonBenét Ramsey case highlight the challenges of adapting to inconclusive evidence while maintaining procedural integrity. While shifts were evidence-driven, they reinforced uncertainty in the public record and illustrate how evolving hypotheses can influence both internal momentum and external perception. This dynamic underscores the difficulty of resolving cases with limited or contaminated evidence, where procedural decisions must balance caution, thoroughness, and interpretive judgment. Given the documented shifts in prosecutorial theory, which approach do you think was most aligned with the available evidence at the time, and why? In the aftermath of the initial investigation into JonBenét Ramsey's death, a grand jury was convened to review the available evidence and determine whether formal charges were warranted. Records indicate that the grand jury proceedings, including deliberations and recommendations, were sealed for an extended period, limiting both public and investigative transparency. Prosecutors later confirmed that no indictment was publicly issued at the time, and official commentary emphasized that the reasoning behind the decision remained confidential under legal statutes protecting grand jury secrecy. This prolonged lack of disclosure created a climate of speculation regarding the evaluation of evidence and prosecutorial judgment.
For years, the public was left unaware of whether the grand jury had recommended charges, creating an information void in a case already dominated by uncertainty. Documents and reporting indicate that the grand jury considered physical evidence, including the ransom note, basement discovery, and forensic findings such as the unidentified male DNA, alongside parental and witness statements. Despite the breadth of material reviewed, prosecutors declined to issue formal clarification regarding how the evidence was weighed or why specific leads were ultimately discounted. Legal experts note that sealing recommendations is not uncommon, but in high-profile cases, it can amplify suspicion and undermine confidence in investigative consistency. The lack of public insight leaves an unresolved question. What conclusions, if any, did the grand jury reach, and how might they have influenced the course of the investigation? Later commentary from legal analysts emphasizes that the grand jury's discretion allowed consideration of multiple theories without mandating indictment, yet the absence of transparency complicated independent assessment of procedural decisions. Public reporting confirmed that investigative staff were aware of the limitations imposed by secrecy, and that some lines of inquiry could not be fully contextualized in subsequent reviews due to the lack of official disclosure. As a result, critical decisions regarding leads, suspects, and timing were left without formal clarification for years. The sealed proceedings created a lasting shadow over the investigation, leaving both officials and the public to interpret incomplete data without authoritative guidance. Evidence reviewed by the grand jury likely included early scene reports, parental statements, forensic sampling, and tips not fully pursued during initial investigation. While some analysts suggest that these materials could have supported actionable recommendations, no documentation confirms whether the grand jury reached consensus or issued partial guidance. The effect of this secrecy has been a recurring source of speculation in public and professional discourse, with commentators noting that decisions made during this period remain fundamentally opaque.
Without insight into the grand jury's considerations, investigators and the public alike are left to evaluate the case using incomplete evidence and procedural context. Grand jury proceedings were convened and recommendations remained sealed. No formal indictment was issued publicly, and the reasoning behind decisions was not disclosed. It is possible that the grand jury did not find sufficient evidentiary weight to authorize charges against any individual. It might also be likely that the jury considered multiple theories, including family and intruder scenarios, but could not reach definitive conclusions due to limitations in physical evidence and procedural contamination. Another possibility is that recommendations were submitted but withheld by prosecutors in order to preserve future flexibility or to protect privacy, illustrating the procedural discretion inherent in grand jury processes. These interpretations remain theoretical and rely exclusively on official procedural records and public reporting. The secrecy surrounding the grand jury proceedings continues to shape public perception of the JonBenét Ramsey case. While protective statutes govern confidentiality, the effect has been persistent speculation and enduring ambiguity regarding investigative and prosecutorial decision-making. This opacity underscores the challenge of assessing cases where legal discretion intersects with high-profile scrutiny. Given the documented grand jury secrecy, what do you think might have influenced the decision to withhold recommendations, and how could that have affected the trajectory of the investigation? In recent years, the JonBenét Ramsey case has experienced a resurgence of investigative potential due to advances in DNA technology. Modern genealogical techniques allow investigators to analyze minute samples without consuming the entire specimen, an improvement over the limitations faced during the original examination in 1996. Public reporting indicates that partial DNA profiles, once considered insufficient for actionable insight, can now be cross-referenced with genealogical databases to identify potential familial connections. This capability has reopened avenues previously regarded as technically impossible and has prompted law enforcement to re-examine archived evidence using these enhanced methods. A sample previously deemed inconclusive could now provide a genealogical lead that was entirely unattainable 25 years ago. Laboratory improvements permit analysis of degraded or partial DNA markers, minimizing the risk of destruction during retesting. Forensic services have repeatedly emphasized that these advancements allow the same sample to be tested multiple times using different protocols, increasing the probability of extracting usable genetic information. Public statements confirm that archived evidence, including swabs from JonBenét's clothing and the ransom note, are now eligible for testing using these contemporary methods. This has sparked cautious optimism among investigative teams that decades-old evidence may finally yield actionable insight. The question remains whether these modern techniques can generate a reliable match without contamination interference from early crime scene handling. Despite the technical potential, official reports stress that limitations persist. Partial markers, environmental degradation, and early contamination reduce confidence in definitive results. Analysts advise that even with advanced methods, samples may yield information that points to familial relationships rather than direct identification of a perpetrator. Consequently, the application of genetic genealogy must be paired with corroborating investigative work to validate any leads. The process remains methodical and cautious, as misinterpretation might inadvertently misdirect resources or generate public confusion.
The technological leap provides a bridge between archived uncertainty and the possibility of previously inaccessible answers, fundamentally reshaping investigative strategy. Public reporting highlights that similar applications of genetic genealogy have solved cold cases across the United States, including cases where no suspect DNA was previously known.
Investigators on the Ramsey case have indicated that the approach could identify distant relatives of the unknown DNA contributor, allowing traditional investigative methods to narrow down potential individuals. While promising, officials emphasize that the technology cannot override procedural limitations such as compromised initial crime scene integrity or uncollected corroborative evidence. Advances in DNA analysis have shifted the case from one constrained by technical impossibility to one where modern science may illuminate previously inaccessible truths. Modern genetic genealogy and improved DNA analysis allow small, archived samples from JonBenet's clothing and the ransom note to be retested without destruction, producing partial profiles suitable for familial comparison. It is possible that retesting could identify previously unknown familial connections, providing investigative leads towards potential suspects. It might also be likely that any match would identify distant relatives rather than the direct perpetrator, requiring additional investigative steps to establish access and motive. Alternatively, degradation and contamination might limit conclusiveness, meaning results may remain probabilistic rather than definitive. These interpretations remain theoretical, relying exclusively on documented capabilities of contemporary forensic and genealogical methods. The impact of modern DNA science on the Ramsey case exemplifies the interplay between technological advancement and cold case investigation. While results cannot be guaranteed, the application of genetic genealogy transforms previously static evidence into a dynamic tool capable of reshaping investigative understanding. The process underscores the cautious optimism that science can contribute without overstating conclusions, maintaining investigative rigor while exploring new avenues of inquiry. Given the documented advances in DNA technology, what do you think is the most likely outcome if the archived Ramsey samples are fully retested using modern genetic genealogy methods? In the lead-up to the 30th anniversary of JonBenét Ramsey's death, law enforcement confirmed that follow-up interviews had been conducted with individuals connected to the case. Public statements indicated that these sessions were designed to reassess prior accounts, clarify previously ambiguous details, and incorporate new investigative approaches, including advances in forensic science. Despite confirmation of these interviews, authorities withheld names, locations, and specific content, limiting public knowledge and maintaining confidentiality consistent with ongoing procedural discretion. Some of the interviews reportedly revisited primary witnesses from the original investigation, raising questions about what new information might have emerged after decades of silence. Details regarding the scope and outcome of these interviews remain scarce. Investigators emphasized that the sessions were part of a broader effort to reassess evidence, including physical materials, digital records, and previously unexamined tips. While no new suspects were formally identified in public statements, the acknowledgement of active follow-up demonstrates that the case continues to receive investigative attention despite the elapsed time and prior limitations. The combination of confirmed activity and withheld information contributes to an ongoing sense of uncertainty, leaving the public and analysts to speculate about the potential impact of these renewed inquiries. Even with modern techniques and decades of review, the precise content of these interviews remains opaque, preserving the case's unresolved status while signaling that authorities have not closed investigative possibilities. The limited disclosure highlights how ongoing review can maintain procedural momentum while simultaneously amplifying public curiosity and suspense. Police confirmed follow-up interviews occurred with individuals related to the case. Names and details were not disclosed. It is possible that these interviews aim to reconcile inconsistencies in earlier statements or explore leads generated by modern forensic methods such as genetic genealogy. It might also be likely that new evidence or perspectives could refine the understanding of sequence and access without identifying a direct suspect.
Another possibility is that interviews serve primarily to document perspectives for archival and procedural completeness, rather than producing immediate actionable findings. These interpretations rely solely on official statements confirming the activity and the lack of disclosed outcomes.
Given the limited information about these new interviews, what do you think investigators might hope to uncover at this late stage in the case? Decades after JonBenét Ramsey's death, the case remains an unfinished record, suspended between procedural gaps, early investigative limitations, and potential breakthroughs offered by modern forensic techniques. Archival documentation highlights areas where initial handling, scene contamination, and delayed follow-up left unresolved questions, creating enduring challenges for reconstructing the sequence of events. The cumulative effect of incomplete interviews, untested leads, and sealed grand jury proceedings has resulted in a factual record that is simultaneously extensive and fragmentary, illustrating the tension between known evidence and unknown variables. Some physical evidence collected in the earliest hours may have contained critical insights that, if fully preserved or tested at the time, could have significantly altered investigative direction. Ongoing case management emphasizes that while modern DNA retesting and genealogical methods provide potential avenues for resolution, the historical record cannot be rewritten. Procedural limitations, contamination risks, and partially documented investigative decisions constrain the conclusions that can be drawn from existing materials. Consequently, each new analysis must be considered in the context of what was preserved, what was lost, and what remains untested. The possibility exists that overlooked evidence or incomplete documentation still holds information capable of clarifying sequence, access, or identity. Every deferred lead and ambiguous note contributes to the sense that the case remains open-ended, a puzzle with missing pieces that may never be fully recovered. The unfinished record underscores both the limits of historical investigative work and the potential for scientific and procedural advances to illuminate previously inaccessible information. The Ramsey case exhibits multiple procedural gaps, including early evidence handling, incomplete interviews, and untested leads. It is possible that properly preserved and analyzed evidence could clarify critical sequence or access points. It might also be likely that some early gaps are irrecoverable, leaving only probabilistic assessments of what occurred. Another possibility is that modern forensic methods may identify connections previously obscured, but results will remain contingent on sample integrity and corroborative investigation. These interpretations are derived strictly from documented limitations and procedural records. Considering the gaps in the historical record, what do you think is the most promising avenue for finally resolving the unanswered questions in this case?